So this is going to be a quick review of the control flow 1.5 lesson from the Developing Swift curriculum, the fundamentals. So control flow is all about making decisions, basically, and the way we do that is we say, well, if a certain condition is true or false, then we're going to do this. Basically, that's the basics behind it. So you can read through this in more detail, but these are the different operators we use to make decisions with, to do some sort of comparison. Say, well, if this is larger than this, then we're going to do this. Or, if this is larger than this and another condition is true as well, then we're going to do this. However, this out of context isn't that useful if you've never seen these things before. So we're going to look at them in context. So a basic if statement, and we come over here, a good way to think about writing them and learning them is actually to learn the structure of them first. So if I say if is the keyword that we need to write to indicate we want to write a conditional statement. So at this point now, sort of Swift knows that I'm going to write some sort of condition. So we would have like a condition here, and then we would have open and closing curly braces. Now notice because we haven't used these yet, so notice when I put the first curly brace in, I only actually typed the opening one. It put in the closing one for me, and then it leaves the cursor in the middle. So I could type, however, the kind of style that you'll see Apple use a lot now is if I hit return, you see I can like open it up, and you can see it's got like an opening and closing curly brace. So what we want to think of is within here is where we could write code. And the code is going to execute if the condition is true, basically. And you'll see similar things with like functions. So we like define the function here, and then an open and closing curly braces, and you can write a load of code. And that's going to run if you call it, if it's a function, but in a condition if this condition is true. So we could write some basic conditions like is 10 larger than 5? Right, but as we discussed in the last lesson, hard coding values like this is not very useful. The code is not reusable now. This is the only thing it can do. And I could print at this point 10 is larger than 5. Oh, let's keep that the same, yeah? So if this condition, so we write the keyword if, then we write a condition, then we have open and closing curly braces, and then within that we write all our code. So, we could write multiple things for our program to do as well. It can execute many things, it can call functions, it can do all sorts of stuff in here if you want it to do. So that's the basic premise, right? Now, one thing to understand is that we're going to look at kind of else and else if and things like that in a moment. But actually, if you wanted your code to just do something if a condition is true, and if it's not true, just don't do anything. Like, we don't need it to do anything. If it's not true, then you might end up just writing this. No else, no else if and stuff like that. Just if condition, and then do something if it's true. And if it's not true, the program would just continue on and it wouldn't execute anything. So we're going to make this code a little more useful, because that's not very useful just hard coding numbers like that. So let's create some variables. So variable, I've literally got a cup of tea in front of me. I love tea. So let's say cup empty is our variable, and I'm going to set that to false to start with. And let's have another variable of like hour of the day, and set it to 10 o'clock. Yeah. So now I'm going to say, well, if my cup empty, right? So if cup empty is true, then let's say put the kettle on, yeah? So what you might see, now we're going to come on to these in a second, but what you might see with a Boolean value like this, so this up here is just set to true or false, right? So this is a bool, is you don't need any comparison operator with this. And this is a little bit confusing the first time you see it. You just see like if and then something. And you're thinking, hang on a minute, you just said I need a condition like with one of these operators and they're not using one. But if it's just a Boolean value, basically it knows to just check, is this true? And if it is, run something. Yes, it's looking for this to be true. So if I run it right now, it's not going to do anything. But if I change this to true and we run it, there we go, put the kettle on. I didn't need any comparison operators. It knows that it's a Boolean value, so it just checks if it's true or false. If it's true, it runs. Yeah, so if we come back here though, if I wanted to write this more explicitly, then I might go double equal sign true. Now we've been using the single equal sign so far up here to assign things, putting the thing on the right and the thing on the left. The double equal sign is a comparison, yeah? Then it's checking that both sides must be the same. So it's checking, is cup empty the same as this side? So in this case, it's true. It'd be the same as if I just had like the hard-coded numbers 10 and 10. It's just checking, is 10 the same as 10? Well, it is, so this evaluates the true as a statement. Whereas you see the next one down, exclamation mark equal sign, means not the same as. So this would evaluate to false because it's checking that these two things on each side are not the same, but they are the same, so it evaluates to false. So that's kind of what we're doing with this. We create a condition, we're generally having two things on each side, and in the middle, one of these comparison operators. But like I said, if you are just checking against a Boolean variable, then you don't actually need that. So we could just go back to cup empty. However, for clarity, I'm going to put in the equals true for now, right? So that's a very simple if statement, and it's just going to check, is my cup empty? And if that's true, then we need to put the kettle on. And then what's going to happen in our code is it will just continue on. So if cup empty is false, we wouldn't do anything, we just carry on. However, we might want some additional sort of statements here. So what we might write now is else. And again, after else, open up a curly brace and it provides me a closing, and I'm just going to create some space. Right now, this is very, very good kind of, English sort of syntax. So if a condition is true, do this in the code block, else do this in the code block. So we might print at this point, drink your tea. Yeah. So if we run it now, we get put the kettle on because cup empty is true. But if we get a false and change that to false, drink your tea. Yeah, so it's making a decision based on this basically. So if we go back to here, we can start making more sort of checks essentially as we kind of go through things. So what we might want to start doing is doing this though, where we are checking multiple conditions basically at the same time. And that's where these logical operators come in. So the double ampersands and the sort of double vertical lines that you see down here. And this allows us to check multiple things. So we could do something like up here of just having a sort of check, because maybe I don't like to drink tea too early in the morning. So I'm going to check if my cup is empty, and so I'm going to use the double ampersand, and then I need to write a new condition here. And I'm going to say, well, if the hour is greater than 9 o'clock. Yeah, so if my cup's empty and it's past 9 o'clock, then I'm going to put the kettle on. So I'm just going to get rid of this here. So we go back to the simple if statement. Yeah. So I might want to create some different conditions now. So the way we do that is we use else if. Yeah. So it's like we're writing else and we put the word if in front of it, essentially. So this allows me to write a new condition. Whereas if you remember when we just had, when we had else here, there was no condition, because else is like a default case. Yeah, so it's like, well, we check all the kind of ifs and the else ifs, and then else comes at the end, and it's kind of like a default case, basically. There is no condition. It's just if none of these else if and if conditions are true, then we just drop through to else and do that. And the thing to understand with this is it's looking for the first case to evaluate to true. Basically, if else if is true, this thing here, then we will never get to else to even check it, yeah? So if we create a new condition, so we say else if, and then we're going to write a condition here. So let's say cup empty equals true. Let's say and the hour is let's say smaller than let's go for like smaller than say like 8 o'clock, like 2000 hours. Then this time though we are going to print time for hot chocolate, because it'll be chocolate, yeah? Oh, sorry, hour is greater than is what we probably want to make this make sense, yeah? So we can say, well, if the cup is empty, so if the cup empty equals true, and the hour is greater than 20, representing kind of 8 o'clock in 24-hour time, to make this simple, then we're going to print time for hot chocolate. So you can see how we're starting to check multiple conditions. So we're checking two conditions on this line. Is the cup empty and the hour greater than 9 o'clock in the morning? Put the kettle on. Else, if the cup empty is true and the hour is larger than 8 o'clock, print time for hot chocolate. And this is where we might want just our default case of else print, get on with some work. So I'm always thinking about having a cup of tea. So this is the basic structure, and hopefully you can see the way that I was kind of typing out the syntax. So like if, condition, and then open and close brackets with like do something, yeah? And then if you want else if, so we want else if, new condition, yeah? And then we open and close brackets, do something else. And then we finish off with else, and open close brackets, no condition this time on else, and this is kind of like default case, yeah? So it's going to drop through, and if none of the if or else if conditions are true, then we run whatever is in the else. If you want, like I mentioned at the beginning, you can do this. You don't need an else with an if statement. So if you wanted to check a load of things, but actually if they're all false, just do nothing, then get rid of else, because it's going to check all these conditions, and then if they're all false, it will just carry on and it won't execute anything. So that is a really quick overview of if statements, and remember you could use or, so we could put, wouldn't make a lot of sense, but we could put or in there. So if this is then looking for any of these conditions to be true, so if this is true or this is true, it doesn't matter which one, it's going to execute the code. So that's all basically, and that can be quite useful. So the next kind of subject we get onto is switch statements. So what I would suggest doing is not moving on to switch statements till you've really understood this and you're confident with if, else if, and else. And when you are, you can move on to switch statements, which are basically this very similar thing. It's just a different way of doing it. So you might prefer this way if you're going to have a huge amount of cases, because you imagine if you're going to have a lot of else if cases, it's going to rack up to be a huge amount of code. So what we might do is say, let's create a variable called points and equal that to 100 maybe. So this allows us to check lots and lots of different conditions. So the first thing we do is we write the keyword switch, not Swift, switch. And then we switch on a variable. So this is why I created the variable to begin with. So I'm going to write points, right? And then you open a code block using a curly brace. And I'm going to make some space because we're going to need a bit of space. So I've made some space in there. And then the first thing you write now is we start writing our cases, basically. So like case 0, and what it's going to do is it's going to check each case against the variable, the piece of data. And this doesn't just work on numbers. You could be checking for words, strings basically, and things like that if you want as well. So I'm going to say case 0 is, so imagine this is like a game, and it's checking the amount of points you got. So we could have like, just getting started, so that's what's going to happen if this case 0 matches with this variable, essentially. So then we could have like case, now this is where we could have specific numbers. However, what is quite useful, and you can see up here you could do strings even if it's just individual letters if you want, but you can do this, so you can include number ranges. So let's say if case 1, now the important thing here is to think it through and make sure you don't overlap your number ranges. So you have these full colons as well after each case. So let's print good start, yeah, and then we could have another case. Let's do, just save some time, let's do 10 to 99. Let's print well done, and then a final case of 100, and we'll print completed or something like that. Yeah. Now, what you'll find if you try and run this, you're going to get an error. So if we try and run it, we get an error. So what we need to do is, just wondering if it gives us I think as well we've used points before. Let's just come up here. So remember, you can only use a variable name once. I've used this later on in this page. So I'm just going to change this point score and make sure this is the same. Point score, run. Yeah, so you'll get this error here, right? So switch must be exhaustive. So what that means is, if we go back and look at the example, it has this default case. So like with an if statement where you have like else, the default case it drops to, you have the same in switch. The only difference really is that with if statements, the else case is optional. You could use it or you could not use it. Whereas with a switch statement, you have to have a default case. So, but the default case could just be like an error, like something's gone wrong. Yeah, because you might, what I'd recommend is that within your cases, you try and cover all eventualities and then use the default as like a catch-all. So, error, basically, something's gone wrong if we're getting the default case, because maybe the game is built that the points should only go between 0 and 100. So if they're outside of that range, then we've either programmed something wrong here or something's gone wrong with our code somewhere. So if we run now, we get completed. Yeah, so if we try and change this around, if I go to 0, then just getting started. So you can see how like it's switching on the different, so if I go in the middle of a range, like 46, then we'll go into this one, hopefully. Well done. Yeah, so switch is great. So remember, you just write the keyword switch, you then write a variable name that you're going to switch on. So it needs to link to like a string or numbers, things like that. And then you write your cases, a case to match against, and full colon, and then what you want it to do. Because obviously it might not just be printing, you might be doing things here, calling functions and executing code that does things with UI and stuff like that. So that's switch statements. And then the last thing that's covered by this is ternary operators. Now, ternary operators are basically a shorthand way of doing things. So you see all this if statement here. This could actually be rewritten to do something, to do the same thing in just one line of code like this. So it's saying, well, we're going to create, we have created this variable called largest, and we're going to set it to a condition. So is A bigger than B, right? So that evaluates to true, A is bigger than B. Then you write a single question mark with gaps around it or spaces around it. And then you provide the true and false answers. So A is the true answer and B is the false answer, separated by a full colon. However, this is nice shorthand syntax, but you might find for a while I would stick maybe with writing like if statements like up here and switch statements for a while until you've really got confident with those, and then you can refactor those into just one line of code basically, like this. But bizarrely, if you read a lot about Apple's kind of approach, this isn't very Apple because it's not very expressive in terms of what's really going on and things like that, you know, whereas this is much closer to English in terms of its readability. But you know, for simple things, you might refactor it so that you're using a ternary operator, which is the question mark. The other reason why this might get a little bit complicated is we'll look at optionals at some point, which also uses a question mark, but for a very different reason, and not to get confused with that, basically. So that's conditional statements. So have a go at the exercises and see if you can pass the tests.